the public service. So we're going to speak now to the Public Service Commission Chairperson, Professor Somadoda Fikeni, because there are suspended officials in government who continue to receive salaries, and you and I as taxpayers are spending about 800 million rand each year on salaries of suspended public servants at national and provincial level, many of whom have been suspended for many, many years. And there are currently 674 officials at national and provincial that are on suspension. This was reported by the Sunday Times yesterday. Over 500 of them have been suspended for more than 90 days. But there are other officials in the public service who've been suspended for more than a year, many others for more than 2 years. This is concerning. This 800 million rand could be spent on other important things. Professor Somadoda Fikeni joins us now on the line. He's the chairperson of the Public Service Commission. Prof, thank you so much for making time for us. Good morning.
Good morning, Clement, and good morning to your listeners and your colleagues.
800 million rand a year. That's a lot of money to spend on people who are sitting at home after being suspended.
It is actually a disaster because even that 800 million, we're talking about those that we know. The public service is so fragmented that you will find that in the municipalities you do not have central data to say how many people are suspended. And there are certain public sector employees, such as those in parliament, they are not necessarily under the Public Service Act at this stage. So you will also go to state-owned entities, state-owned companies, and find that their own suspensions are not even factored in here. So my suspicion is that the numbers could be greater. And as the Public Service Commission, we said, this situation is untenable. It's just not sustainable, and it just demonstrates the lack of seriousness about statecraft and governance.
Yeah, and then we're talking over R1 billion then, if there are also these other industries and sectors that are not accounted for, because there's just no system, centralized system, that accounts for all of them. So, and we'll get to what the solution is, Prof, in a moment. But one of the things that shocked me in this Sunday Times report was this specific case that they cited of a deputy director in the Department of Women, Youth and People with Disabilities who was suspended in 2018 and subsequently found guilty of financial misconduct. That person received more than 5 million rand despite his position being filled by someone else, and the department now wants to transfer him while the matter is in the labor court. Why do government entities or departments often go with this approach of transferring people? Because you'd be told that, someone maybe who was found to have been involved in irregularities in the procurement sector is now being moved to another department that doesn't deal with supply chain and procurement. But still, that person is still getting paid, and their disciplinary hearing often is not even completed. What's the story around these transfers?
There may be two reasons. For example, you find that in these labor-intensive departments, such as your teaching and police, you may have many people who have done something wrong. Let's say a person has sexually harassed children, and now on suspension you can't return that person to the teaching environment. But it is also the lack of imagination of people in terms of giving that person some work elsewhere. But the moment you have your internal HR disciplinary processes in place, you ought to release the person at some point. This one of saying it's because the case has not been completed is a demonstration of utter failure within the system of holding people accountable, because you can have your own internal disciplinary process and conclude it without waiting for the prolonged cases at times. Of course, it might be that a person says, I'm waiting for DNA specimen or whatever testing to make sure that the rape was a rape. Therefore, the school doesn't have the technical know-how on how to prove that or otherwise. But in the cases that we've come across, that is just used as an alibi. The real thing here is the collapse of HR units within the organization, or the abuse of the system by those who lead, either HR or sometimes accounting officers, or sometimes the political figures who will have been presiding over the process. The guidelines are clear, and there should be no reason to transfer. But the problem in this country, the absence of a biometric system and integrated data, wherein you disappear in one place and then you are replaced, you are placed elsewhere. Or even worse, sometimes people are found to have done something wrong. Then they resign before the disciplinary makes its verdict, something that should change in terms of the law. Then they reappear in another province, in another department, refurbished. Then they get a higher position. Then they get expelled for the same reasons, which is one of the cases that I've come across, because most of these people will always do the same thing with the same external persons if it was involving tenders. Then that same person got even a higher posting in the third department where they went into. So we're one of few countries on earth which is blessed with failing upwards.
Why do precautionary suspensions of public officials tend to be so prolonged? Because one of the cases that were cited was of an Enfileni municipality accountant and a senior clerk who were suspended 7 years ago. They were paid 9 million rand. And just one wonders, in fact, you've also spoken about a case of someone who was suspended for 12 years with full pay, who complained later about not getting a bonus. I mean, you can't make that stuff up. And there must be somewhere a blockage when it comes to disciplinary processes, or that department really is not serious about holding that person accountable. They've just put them at home because maybe that person was proving to be a challenge.
In fact, for me, if anything, when I joined the Public Service Commission, fresh from the academic world, and this story was sort of told nonchalant, blasé, it's more like one of those things. It's one of the things that shocked me, and I wondered, am I in the right place? Then we went to pursue the matter of these prolonged suspensions, saying we are willing to go to the department, to the cabinet, to argue that by a certain date, everybody should report back or their salary be stopped. And so that we know if there is a tangible case or not. You will be surprised that most of these cases, it's when internal players collude, maybe say so-and-so is a problem, or we want to do something to remove so-and-so. It's better to just suspend, use this blunt instrument against the regulation from the Public Service and Administration Department, which says you can only suspend a person for 60 days if needs be whilst collecting information. But if the person doesn't pose any threat within, the person can continue working whilst the disciplinary is taking place. Only after 60 days that the chairperson of a disciplinary process will say, I would like another 30 days so that we finalize collecting information, or I would like an extension, but that cannot go into years. So here it's either collusion or complete failure of the system. And remember, you can't then appoint people in the position of a person who is still there in the establishment. You can only bring them to act, which means you've crippled that particular department or institution permanently, because the person who is brought in to act sometimes doesn't have the specialization of that particular area.
Mm.
Never mind that the morale of other employees who have to brave the elements every morning, who have to pay for fuel, who have to pay for food, who have to drop kids and start running towards work.
Mm.
You have a person who is sitting at home doing nothing but being paid.
Yeah. And of course, in other cases, as you've indicated, suspension may be used to remove officials who refuse to cooperate with improper procurement or irregular appointments or unlawful dismissal, whatever the case is.
Yes.
And those who are compliant can be placed on those roles, or suspensions get used to protect implicated officials. So you create an impression that there is actually accountability, but what you're doing is actually drag that DC while the official continues to receive their salary. What's the solution then, Prof? As you said, it's untenable. The situation is unsustainable. It speaks to the collapse of HR units. So what can be done?
The first one is to make sure that department that issues regulations is given capacity and the mandatory duty to monitor how many people are on suspension, how many people, have completed the process, and if they are being placed elsewhere, is that placing elsewhere reasonable and within the law? The second one is simply to make sure that people who manage those prolonged suspensions and departments or institutions can never get, clean audit if they do not demonstrate that they were managing those processes properly. And people who are in those units do not get the pay progression, promotions, and so forth, renewal of contracts when you have such staggering things, if it can be proven that failure was due to them doing nothing. Same with the accounting ecosystem, parliament, minister, mayors, and so forth. Those things ought to be highlighted as standing items. Then, of course, I've already alluded to the integrated data system, which will tell each time this thing is done and indicate. Nowadays, with AI assistance, it is easier to track and monitor and make decisions to see who is on suspension just at a click of a button, rather than saying we need to go elsewhere. Remember, we raised this issue almost 3 years ago, quite forcefully. But somehow today we're still talking about it. The same thing with the ghost employees. You find that years pass. In a common sense and honest system, within a few months you would have solved those things, then have some standardization of public service or the public sector generally, so that you do not have people who say, no, we're in a different policy regime, we're in the municipalities, we're in a different policy regime, we're in parliament, we're in a different policy regime, we're in this and that, so that you do have a dashboard where you can see all these things. And ministers ought to also have their performance, as well as the DGs or HODs, aligned to this particular problem, because it is a serious problem for the state.
So how close are we to getting there?
At least the problem has been recognized. We're beginning to have some degree of cooperation, professionalization of public service, which will also change the manner of appointment of people. The recent policies which delineate political and administrative roles of accounting officers, as well as the Public Service Commission bill, once passed by the NCOP, because National Assembly has overwhelmingly supported it, then our powers will extend to local government, to state entities, which all along we were told, no, you can only deal with the department and talk about those, but not deal with them directly. Now that the powers will be extended, I do think that it should be possible. We will also have single public administration in a sense. It will be easier to say these are the new laws and this is how they should be applied. And of course, we're working with the Auditor General and other constitutional bodies to say, let's combine our efforts so that the sampling by the Auditor General should be combined with other observations of entities such as the Public Service Commission and others to make sure that we have combined assurances here. So there are reforms taking place, if supported, because the other problem with South Africa, good policies, we are not lacking in those. But the issue of coordination, fragmentation, and implementation is still a huge problem. And I'm beginning, Clement, to be convinced. I'm developing a concept which I call the political economy of inefficiency. Our inefficiency as a country is not by default, it is by design. It's a business model for other people.
Yeah, it's quite shocking because those are people to think that there are people whom inefficiency can benefit at that level. Then we're fighting a beast here, because you trying to fix things and bring about reforms that are going to get us to a better place is actually threatening their business prospects. So there's going to be a fight back.
Let me give you a simple example. In the Northwest Province, the airport is solidly in place, but there is no flight flying out of Mahikeng, the only province without such. Why? It's over the tenders who was given control over what. There was a year when in the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, it took almost 6 months with radio talk shows, TV showing this, textbooks not delivered. Not because there were no textbooks. They were in the warehouse. And it was just over the tenders. I think this tender system is becoming a cancer that is choking our system. Now you realize that if you ask an aunt in your village, we have a crisis of delivering books before schools open, that aunt will be able to just mobilize bakkies and say, give me the delivery notes, and they will solve that problem in 1 week. And a complex state such as ours cannot deliver textbooks because people have minimized the maximum and maximized the minimum, where tenders have become the national goal rather than saying they were a service to reach a particular goal. It cannot be. So our corruption at some levels will not look like state capture. It will look like these inefficiencies which have become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Water delivery, where just leakages are allowed so that people who have tankers will, prosper. So inefficiency in this country is a multi-billion industry, and it is deliberate. Similarly, we debate about the issue of, foreign nationals, this and that. There's nothing to be added. If you were to just apply the law which exists,
that's it.
You will have solved 90% of the problems. Now, imagine when they say small businesses that come to open, you'll need to have 4 million to show that you are coming to invest. I mean, a person who has a barber shop who cut 5 heads per day cannot have had a 5 million. And at times, we just allow for such things. You know that we do have this thing of anybody who wants to be a priest or who wants to practice apprenticeship in crime, they say South Africa will be your best bet. As soon as you land, you'll just mention some words in the constitution, but the laws are there. But when you look at the inefficiency, Department of Labor, which is supposed to monitor, is not working with the Department of Home Affairs, which issue permits. And Department of Home Affairs is not working with the Department of Higher Education, which has a list of scarce skills. Then you can see that this inefficiency is but deliberate, because people can no longer live without these inefficiencies, which basically
Sure.
is corruption by other means.
Yeah, they've created an entire industry. All right, let's do these WhatsApp voice notes that have come through before we wrap up our chat.
Hi, Clement and the team. Hi, Prof. Prof, don't you think that we need to interrogate the role played by the unions? Because on some occasions, they tend to protect their members without considering the allegations. David in Rosebank.
If you add bonuses and benefits and perks and all the other extra nonsense that we pay for politicians to get for free, it's probably triple that 800 million rand conservative estimate per year.
Yeah, that's really likely. Professor Fikeni, there was a question there about interrogating the role played by unions. In your experience, your observation, what have you seen in as far as their role is concerned?
It is quite fragmented. Let's put it this way. Unions are always necessary to fight for the rights of workers, and that should be respected as one of the constitutional requirements. But there are instances where you find that, and these tend to be localized rather than being a national position of a union, where you find that there is a certain strong man who just cannot be touched and so forth, and managers start trembling because it's the unions. Leadership and accountability, it's about having courage to take decisions. But once you say, I fear touching other people, then problem comes, because any application of discipline inconsistently itself becomes corruption. So you can no longer say you are applying it on the next person to demonstrate that you can do it if you are not doing it because you fear some of the unions or union leaders. I do think that managers should just manage with courage. Of course, sometimes it used to be compounded by the fact that some of the unions would be linked to the political principle, and the political principle, therefore, being the person who might be the minister or HOD and so forth. So that in itself compounds the factor. But there are several unions in the public sector, your NEHAU, your SATU, your Public Service Association and so forth, who compete for the space, and they self-correct at times when one of theirs tend to go the other way. But ultimately, when you take a leadership position, you should not take a leadership position because you want to be safe, you want to be loved. You should take it because there is a principle that you stand by, and there is always a guide of constitutional values and principles in the section 195 of the Constitution that you should just follow.
Professor Somadoda Fikeni, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. He's the chair of the Public Service Commission. Let's just hope that they are able to get somewhere closer to finding solutions to this mess in our public service. I mean, 800 million rand, that's how much you and I as taxpayers are spending on people that are just sitting at home because they've been suspended. And the prof says that doesn't even include state SOEs, doesn't include the local governments or the municipalities, the metros, doesn't include certain state agencies. Can you imagine how much money is? Some of them are suspended for 12 years on full pay, and they still even complain about their bonuses. What do you mean? You haven't been at work for 12 years on full pay, and you still are arrogant enough to ask for some bonus? And as the prof says, we're dealing here with a political economy of inefficiency, and that inefficiency is by design. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Hanging out with Clement
on 702.
Let's walk the talk.